So those who are just joining us, we were just talking about notions like women being more likely to step into leadership positions after they've been tapped in the shoulder. Within Miami, we've seen that as well. And Helena, I would really like your sort of perspective on that and from your
So I'll actually give you the evidence-based answer to that, because one of the things about promoting women in leadership is, in fact, Ian touched on this, is that interestingly, even in academia, where we like to do things based on evidence and we like to use research, things like advancing women to reach their career goals seems to be something that's all about lived experience. So they'll roll out people who've perhaps got into leadership positions and said, right, this is the role model, they're going to teach you about leadership and experience as women. And in fact, that's not the way to do it. And I say that in a genuine way, because what you end up with is committees of people who've made it in their career, and there might be some similar threads, but it's not necessarily only apply for a role if they met all 10 requirements in terms of position description, whereas many of our male colleagues would apply when they had on average 4 to 5. So we've got a scenario where people may not have been as confident, where they may have needed sponsorship or done well with sponsorship or encouragement to apply for things. And the last one is credibility. And that's much more when you've even got an intersectionality lens or a diversity lens. Was a lot younger, but I was a Caucasian woman, but if I had had a disability or from a diverse background, it's even more difficult. But if you lack that credibility or others don't see you as being credible or you're the sole representative, it can be a problem. But the more exciting thing about the work we're doing now is not just the individual, because that's the problem if you're focusing on the individual, it's what is the evidence base for effective organisational change. And there's really good strategies, but they're just not being implemented at a broad level. And that's what we really need to work to.
I think at some point I'd really be interested in seeing those stuff, because that would be really interesting to see what we could do with Miami. But pulling back to the tapping on the shoulder bit, because I feel like lots of students, especially within my age group, would like to be interested in seeing what were the conditions in your respective careers where you were in the position to be tapped on the shoulder in the first place. Let's go to Helena for now again, while we're on the roll.
I've been tapped on the shoulder lots of times, but these days I don't tend to necessarily need to do that. I think I've learnt, plus as Ian
So, I mean, how many jobs? I applied for a number of jobs. I think I formally got 2 of the ones that I applied for, and everything else has been, and probably 3, because my original postdoc position, I did what you used to do in the old days, is you used to write letters to people overseas and ask if you could come and work in their lab. So that was kind of like applying as well. So I got my academic role at Deakin. I got in normal competitive application, and the role running the CRC was also, while I was asked to apply, I obviously went through a selection process, and it was a competitive process. But every other role I've had has actually been by, a couple have been out of the blue, and others have just been by discussion over time. And that's a consequence of, I guess, getting to know people, people getting to know you over time. And as things develop and opportunities develop, you're in there. Obviously, because when you're starting at your career, you don't know a lot of people. But if I looked at LinkedIn profiles of some of the Miami people, and they terrify me, the number of things that Miami people have done, and therefore the number of connections that they've got. But it's probably a matter of just not being scared. And I'm not a particularly outgoing person, but it's still possible to make connections in your own way. You just make them with people who don't, I'm not someone who'll meet someone and strike up a productive conversation at a drink session or anything like that. I wish I could, but I don't do it. I'm no good at working a room. I was once shortlisted for a senior role in a university at far too young an age, and they asked me what I would do if I got the job, and I said I'd go and employ someone to coach me on how to work a room, because I have no idea. I didn't get it, so I didn't have to go and employ someone, but yeah. Biotechnology course, and who's also been working at the Flora Institute, and she's just got a full-time job at the Flora Institute. So to a certain extent, I tapped her on the shoulder to work with me last year, and I encouraged someone else to talk to her about a role at the Flora Institute, which is now sort of turned into full-time. I met her because I gave a talk to a group of students at Monash Parkville at the MIPS, Postgraduate Students Association there. I can't even remember why I got selected to do that or asked to do that. And 2 students came up to me afterwards and had a conversation. And Shaz was one of them, and we just stayed in touch. She was interested in politics at that stage. So I mentioned that to someone else who suggested she apply for the Women in Science Meets Parliament exercise, or a comparable thing where you go to Canberra for a couple of days, which she did. And that was a reality check in many ways, finding just how interested or disinterested certain politicians were in science. But just through that, it was very clear what her qualities were and her interests were. And so when I started teaching this subject last year at short notice, I needed some teaching assistants. I thought she'd be terrific, and she was, and she is. And then when someone, Flora needed a science communicator to help out, again, I thought she'd be terrific, and she is. So those are easy appointments to make. And then what starts as a temporary thing morphs into an ongoing role if you do it well.
So it sounds to me that it started off like a chance of conversation, and it seems to me that she sort of cultivated that relationship along the way in a genuine way.
But, so to saying, she asked me, if she could, catch up with me again. And so it was a few months afterwards, we just had coffee. And she talked about, then the politics thing was what we were talking about at that stage. People like to help if they're in a position to help. And the thing is that as you progress in your career and you feel more secure in your career, you're generally in a better position to help other people. And it's really rewarding to do it. But so it doesn't mean you can give someone a job, but you can think about them and learn about them. And if you see an opportunity, you're inclined to steer it towards them.
Yeah.
They get it on their own back. People don't get jobs because they're not qualified, but they hear about and get introduced to career opportunities because they've made a bit of effort beforehand and prepared the way. And that's partly preparing themselves by having the qualifications, by having the interest and being able to demonstrate the interest. You don't necessarily have to have the experience. It helps you've got a bit, but you know, I've done things that I had no experience of doing. You know, the biggest career changes for me were things like that, where someone thought I could do it, but and so they trusted me that to introduce me to someone. You know, I got a job, you know, when I was teaching at Deakin, I was approached to go to the Burnet Institute to essentially spend a year looking at the ethics and essentially logistics almost of running a clinical trial of a live attenuated HIV vaccine. So putting live HIV into healthy volunteers. Now, I had no background in clinical development. I knew nothing about virology. I didn't even know what the Burnet Institute was. But it was circumstances. Someone knew that, you know, I had some management expertise. I'd run a major internal project at Deakin for the Deputy Vice Chancellor at one stage, which ended up not really going anywhere, but I had the experience of doing it. I was frustrated in what I was doing at Deakin at the time because I was running the school on Melbourne campus. I'd come to Melbourne for a year to do that when my mum finished off her MBA, and I wasn't having a lot of fun. And they needed someone to do this job. So what was going to be a year's work, which after 6 months, it was clear it was never going anywhere. It'd been fascinating, but it wasn't going to progress. And the director said, well, there must be something interesting you can do in this institute. And essentially gave me the job of running all their commercial projects and taking on their building project to get their new building. So the institute used to be at Fairfield Hospital, which was closed down. They wanted to move to the Alfred Hospital and be part of the AMRAT development. And so we had to essentially raise the money for design and build a new building as part of a collaboration. And it just gave it to me. So I got trusted to do something with no great expertise, but the support of someone who said, have a go, let me know how it's going, but I trust you.
I think that's really interesting, and I'd like to pivot more now into where the rubber hits the road, because you mentioned that people like to help, and Helena, you mentioned there were instances where like you have to focus on the problem, etc., etc. And in part of like, you know, finding money and like doing the stuff that we do, we've gained really, you know, invaluable advice about how to do things, or part of that's also choosing what was good advice and what was, you know, bad advice for our specific context. I'm interested in now in your current roles where you're doing stuff with like research translation. Well, no, let me reverse tax. Because in the notion where people love to help, and from your collective vantage point, how you felt when you first saw Miami as a concept like a year ago. Maybe Helena?
So the great thing about Miami, which I thought when I started, and I must say after interviewing the summer scholar students this year, which I really enjoyed doing, I was very much hooked on that. One of the great things about young people is they're naive enough not to be stuck in the traditional silos and traditional thinking. They often don't appreciate some of the politics that are actually there. And that's terrific because they think outside the square. So when I first envisaged the summer scholarship program and I ended up sitting with Miami, the program is about taking people from all sorts of different backgrounds, but really promising young people who are brave and courageous and do different things, and embedding them with clinicians in a real world in the healthcare frontline. And actually, they're helping really to try and solve the problem, but they bring this fantastic, passionate interest and genuine naivety, and the senior people want to help them. So you have this really great opportunity, and the sorts of things we saw. There was someone who was wanting to do burns rehabilitation, for example, and they wanted to develop an app to promote burns rather than drawing stick figures on pieces of paper and giving them to patients to go home and do, which is literally what they were doing, which is prehistoric. They wanted us to develop an app program to do it. But there was someone who was in a different campus, a completely different patient context, who wanted to do post-trauma rehabilitation, and someone else who wanted to do aged care rehabilitation. And they're all separate projects, and the students were all embedded in these. And the students got together and went, actually, here's this real commonality. We don't really need an app. We need this different platform and these different innovative ways. And we all just need to come together because there's so many similarities here. There's no way those clinical experts would have come together. There's no way those fields would have worked together. There's no way they would have followed the platform that they ended up using. But the students just saw the commonalities. They were passionate. They saw a different opportunity. The senior people weren't threatened by it because they were mentoring, supporting and watching and encouraging. And the outcome was terrific. So there are lots of examples like that. And in the interviews, like Anne was saying, there were these people that are doing amazing degrees and had done amazing things that were quite inspiring. So I suppose to come back to your point, I think there are some really fantastic things that young people can do when you allow them to be disruptive and you put them in a permissive environment where they're really allowed to be. They don't need to be disruptive, but they end up being disruptors because they don't appreciate some of the boundaries and politics and hierarchies that are actually well entrenched in other parts of the world. And yet we shelter them in universities, so we don't necessarily put them out there. And when we do, we give them these junior roles and they have their roles. Whereas when you're a student, you've got this permission to really go and push the boundaries. So I think it's a fantastic program. I love being involved in it and watching my team of clinicians engage with the students at the moment. We've gone on to employ some of the students who are involved in the programs that were there and have subsequently got grants out of them. So one $5,000 summer scholarship turned into a really good concept, turned into a $2.6 million grant. And that was in 3 months. So there is some, there's some really exciting things. That's a really good success story. I don't think it's going to happen every time. But I think that and there's a lot of prep work behind it. But I suppose I really enjoy that challenge, that sort of disruptive type, interdisciplinary, cross-sectional, stimulatory thinking that so much of our institutions and our hierarchy stops. Doctors don't work with nurses, don't work with allied health, and yet we're all supposed to be making things better for patients. And health doesn't work with engineering, doesn't work with IT. And it's just sad because many of our innovations in health will not come from other doctors who do what we do. They'll come from our patients, or they'll come from the student in behaviour works or in IT or in law and ethics or in, and so it's that diversity of thought and that disruptive thought environment that I think is terrific in these sorts of scenarios.
That's really cool. And I think, Ian, you mentioned something to this effect when we first met in that cafe like a year ago. I'm interested in how you first felt when you heard about students in doing this sort of stuff, because I believe that someone introduced you to us via Mutual. Is that right?
So I was told about you by Hayley Gingell, who was working for Ian Smith, and I think she had provided some help at some stage for your hackathon. So when I first met you, my immediate thought was I should get out of the way because you're already doing a whole lot of things, that some of which I'd thought of and some which I hadn't. Well, I was trying to figure out this vague thing I'd agreed to do for Ian Smith was to say, what could I do to help build the, it was originally just going to be biomaterials focused community at Monash. And then you guys are just driving along, doing exactly the sort of thing that I thought should be done without costing anything and notching up a few successes. So the best thing I could do would be to help you if I could, but not stop you in any way. And so I had no position to it, but I just thought you were terrific and you'd done so much work and actually achieved successes really early. I mean, the hackathon you held, where you had 200 people turned up for a weekend, I think it was, in your first year off. That's pretty extraordinary. And you hadn't come to that just by clicking your fingers. You'd worked towards it. So you're already well on that path to saying, doing something where it's easy for someone to take the position of trying to help you go in one direction or another. They're not trying to start you. You've already started yourself. In your case, you and your colleagues, in a dramatic and highly successful and public manner. Not everybody can do that, but you can always start moving in some direction. And, you know, I mean, you go back to physics. It's a lot easier to deflect a moving object than it is to start one moving from scratch.
So I think that's really interesting, because I think that brings us to the point of, like, you know, the actual implementation of actual healthcare innovation. I don't know.
A minor challenge.
Yeah, definitely. So from my really limited anecdotal experience, culturally there's a sort of inertia towards you know, risk taking within healthcare, and actually, you know, implementation of new sort of approaches to like treatment, etc. In both of your experiences, what has been the biggest barrier towards us, you know, moving forward and translating the world-class research we have in Melbourne into real-world outcomes in a more efficient manner?
Elena, you want to start?
Oh, there's so many. I would say that one of the most challenging things, I can already tell Ian thinks like this, but it's estimated only about 10% of people can think really strategically. So really, to be able to almost sit above the clouds, I think having an MBA helps you but to think strategically. And my world is about implementation. My research is my Trojan horse. So I use research and roles and positions to be able to improve. And I've just written a whole series of articles, there's a whole lot more coming out, and opinion pieces to challenge a lot of the paradigms we use about improvement. One of the biggest challenges is people literally draw these linear pathways and say, well, you start with this and you do this and you do that, and then you end up with that. And there are so many barriers that stop that, what seems to be common sense pathway. And that pathway is the same no matter what end of the research continuum you're going at. But I suppose a couple of key things I would say is people don't start with the right problem. They don't necessarily understand the problem. They haven't necessarily engaged with industry. They haven't engaged with their patients. They haven't engaged with clinicians. They don't really understand the problem they're trying to fix. So they come up with a great idea. I'm seeing this time and time again, even in mine. They come up with with an idea or a solution without understanding the problem. And then we bring the problems to them and they go, oh, no, but this is my solution. And we're going, but the problem is this. You've got to fix the problem. That won't fix it. Oh, yes, but this is what I've developed. This is my research. This is my output. Completely missing the point. And in COVID, John Forsyth from engineering, he's terrific. He's a yin to my yang. He knows all the people in engineering. Chris Bain knows IT, and I've got all the clinical contacts. And we were bouncing people from industry, from IT, from engineering. And one of the things we really picked up in that experience of rapid collaboration sort of for the greater good was that no one project just needed one set of IT or one set of experts. And yet we had all these experts down rabbit holes with their bunny tails in the air, no one sort of looking at the big picture. And we had, you know, problems, for example, with ventilation of patients. So the ventilation was spreading COVID everywhere and everyone was getting it. So we needed to change ventilation. Now, to do that, one person was doing the 3D printing to adapt the ventilation masks, but that wasn't the project. We then had to bring it back and get the virologist to measure viral spread and how we would do that. Then we had to get the flow team, then we had to get the CSSD. And so you needed so many people to come together as moving parts in that. And that's just not inherent in a usual university environment or in a clinical environment. All those people work in their own silos and they have to bump into each other at dinner parties or network or somehow in a corridor to get together. So it was just a really good experience of sort of doing that collaboration on steroids. I think the point is understand the problem. The second thing is overcome all of those barriers for integration and collaboration. And everyone was desperately focused on doing something. Everyone wanted to help, so everyone was really engaged. The other thing is the reality is clinical healthcare is highly complex. And one of the reasons clinicians are seen to be the barrier to innovation, and some of them are, is that they don't engage the hearts and minds of the clinicians, because innovation is always about saving money in healthcare or about saving budgets, and not often really about improving patient care and about what patients need. If you do that, Most doctors and healthcare professionals are pretty altruistic. You can convince them that it really will help the patient, and there's a strong patient voice, they will engage. And when they engage, it's iterative and incremental and complex. It is not a simple paradigm of you do this and you do that and this is what you get. And yet we see in healthcare management and in a lot of getting our research into translating into practice, sees it as a linear process, not an iterative process in a really complex environment where you've got a solution, but it has to be implemented and adapted in so many different ways for so many different contexts. But it can be done. And I think there's countless examples now. And once you learn how to do it and you succeed, you get more and more people on board and you demonstrate that you can do it. And most of the time it's by completely disrespecting the silos and really introducing the disruptors at the same time as having governance, process, transparency, and accountability. And accountability, that's right. And I must say, I've always had consumers and patients as my accountability. They're in everything we do, and they're a voice that stops people from just being self-interested and going back in their silos. So you can tell it's a passionate area, totally doable, but much more complex than people think it is.
Cool. How about Ian? What's your take on this?
If I'll just make sure my dog doesn't take off again.
Your dog has an opinion as well.
Yeah, my dog has opinions. So I apologise for that. I guess a couple of things I'd add, and a little bit strange. The projects I've worked on that I've enjoyed the most have been projects that have had engineers involved and lawyers involved. And engineers actually really good at doing projects. They're organised, they're used to working with other people. They're focused on getting something done that works in a time frame generally. And lawyers are actually also really good for strategy. They can keep you out of trouble and they can create opportunities for you. So I think one of the things we tend to think about, particularly as academics who think they're going to do research translation, is that we can do most of it. And we'll pull in stuff later if we need it to plug a few holes. And, you know, we do sally forth with, you know, probably a bit too much confidence about our own ability without having fleshed things out. Over time, you know, once you've done that a few times and actually not got where you wanted to, then you're more likely to perhaps at least canvas more widely to start with and try and get a slightly more diverse team of people around. And that goes to what you were saying earlier, Darren, before we started, is that you've got to know when to let go of a bit of control. If you want to come up with the most fantastic piece of research and publish in the most prestigious journal, you can do it yourself. You can do it by controlling it. It gets harder, particularly in some of the team-based sciences. If you want to build something of substance, you rarely can do that on your own. And you need to recognise that, and you need to look for complementary people to do it with and give credit and create opportunity to those people.
So I think there was a bit of a point here about, you know, silos and the notion of people within their little, you know, corridors. What's your opinion on how those, you know, form in the first place? It's yeah.
Go on, you go, Helena. I'll think about it a bit more.
I think they were worse traditionally. That's what I would say. I think, look, if you think so, the expert academic, the senior academic leader, a lot of this is about hierarchy and the traditional context of power and control being top-down influence. I think that's a problem. I also think the way our universities and industry and healthcare are structured, the whole system is set up. Beautiful systems diagrams, which I've been working with government around to convince them that if you want researchers, which are funded by public money, to actually invest that in solving public problems for public good, then you actually need to give them incentives to be able to do that, not disincentives. And at the moment, all the incentives are about where you publish and how many grants you get. You're promoted on that, you get your fellowships on that, you get your egos on that, and it's all about how competitive you are and how fantastic you are. Whereas if you start to flip that around and you start to have translation and impacts, up until recently, it's almost a distraction. You didn't get credit for it, patent. If you took time out and did translation, you weren't writing a grant, you weren't writing a paper, and your track record was not going to do that. And I spent 9 years on NHMRC committees, healthcare and then research committee, like a broken record, saying you need to change the incentives so that people get to work in a system which rewards collaboration, rewards translation, rewards impact. You need people to tell their narrative story around impact, you know, which is what we're now seeing. You really have to start to do that. If you change the system such that hospitals are responsible for innovation and have metrics for accreditation for research, which is what we're just about to see coming next year, they will care and they will pull in innovation and pull in research. At the moment, it's a risk and they don't want to do it. It's not their core business. If you incentivize academics for impact and translation, they will do it. If you incentivize clinicians to realise they're the custodians of an innovative, improving health system, not just the individual advocate for their patient clinician experience, people will do the right thing. And we've seen that in the UK. You know, 25% of university funding in the UK is on impact. Yeah. And whether you like the research excellence framework or not, it has transformed behaviour because they have a whole focus on what is our translation impact, how do we train our next generation for translation, and completely different structures that people go, okay, the goalposts move, the incentives over here. So I think we need to not lament so much individual behaviour, but we need to understand that the system drives behaviour with its incentives and its rewards and its disincentives. And if you really want to change things and give people permission and enable them to do great things, you change the incentive system, and that starts to change behaviour that breaks down the silos. But before, the incentives were all about the most egotistical, successful, personal career metrics, and they were the ones that won. Now we see those systems changing, and as those systems change, I think you'll get more disruptive innovation and more collaboration, and the younger generation thinks differently, behaves differently, doesn't respect a lot of the old boundaries that were there. And the universities are starting to work through them too. So I think the system was broken, and the winners who ran the system were not the right people to want to change it because it suited them. That would be my observation.
Yeah, I think that's correct. And I think that is actually it's what distinguishes academia from a lot of industry players. So in the CRC for mental health, our main industry partner was Pfizer. We were lucky enough to, at times, get some senior people from Pfizer in the US to come and help us with a strategic review. One of those people was the Chief Operating Officer of the Neuroscience Research Unit, which was a fairly large part of Pfizer. He'd been in the company 20 years. He trained as a psychiatrist in the UK, did some research at Yale, and then went to Pfizer. And, you know, Pfizer, like many pharmaceutical companies, grew by massive acquisition and probably changed its strategy every 18 months to 2 years over the past 20 years. They've had a major reorganization, or they've done something, or they've dumped the therapeutic area. And actually, during the time that CRC was running, Pfizer did neuroscience, lock, stock and barrel. And, you know, I remember saying, talking to Phil, and he said, how do you cope? He said, well, the key to success in an organisation like Pfizer is to be useful. He said, there will always be change. There will always be strategic change. And what happens then is people look around and say, well, who was useful? Who do we want? He said, so you're successful in the organisation because of what you can do for others. And he then, you know, when the Neuroscience Research Unit disappeared, he went to a more senior role in a different unit. Because of that basic attitude. Look for opportunity to excel, do the job. The job was always interesting. And a company like Pfizer is they have a particular goal, which is to generate new medicines that work and help people. And in doing that, they make money. You know, it's pretty simple. It's a bit more, in some ways, it's a simpler goal than a lot of the universities seem to be able to articulate, because universities seem to try and be many things. Pharma companies try to be one or two things, but have a diversity of impacts. At least that's the story they put out. But as far, from my experience with them, and some of the other pharmaceutical companies said that's actually been true. And, this is, I speak as a career academic. I've never worked in a big company other than my short period of time being paid